When Elizabeth Kübler-Ross agreed to review Matthias Kruger's case in 1998, the team at the Munich University Clinic had already accumulated months of documentation without being able to fit the young man's accounts into any known diagnostic model. What most puzzled the professionals was the historical precision of certain details he spontaneously mentioned, specific elements of the Black Death, despite never having had formal exposure to the subject. It was this point, and not an expectation of unusual phenomena, that motivated the invitation to Ross. As soon as she received the reports, Ross requested a methodological reorganization. She asked the team to resume the interviews, focusing exclusively on the internal consistency of the content and the temporal stability of the accounts. Her objective was simple and rigorous: to verify if the material presented by Matthias behaved as consolidated memory, as fantasy, as a gradual construction, or as something not yet classified by psychological literature. This approach followed parameters similar to those used by Ian Stevenson when examining cases of anomalous memories between the 1960s and 1990s. Right from the first session Ross attended, the direct manner in which the patient described certain intrusive images was striking. He reported that in his mind, densely populated streets appeared, with signs of isolation and markings made on the houses. When asked about the reason for these markings, he replied that they served to warn that there was illness there. There was no hesitation, no additional narrative elaboration. It was a dry statement, with no apparent interest in impressing anyone. The team compared these excerpts with records from previous sessions. The pattern was repeated. Matthias did not expand or embellish what he said. He only described what appeared. For Ross, this was an important indicator. Most adolescents who fantasize or construct narratives tend to vary details or elaborate on descriptions when the subject resurfaces. In Matthias's case, the repetition was almost literal. Another point that drew attention was his spontaneous reference to the year 1348. During the interview, Ross only asked if he could associate his images with any historical period. He answered with that number, without additional context. The team confirmed that the patient had no access, in his schooling or home environment, to material that dealt with the Black Death with such temporal precision. Still, the number coincides exactly with one of the most critical years of the pandemic in Central Europe. Ross registered that these elements, precision without exaggeration, absence of apparent motivation, stable repetition over months, justified an expanded investigation. She requested that the case be treated as a clinical study of anomalous memory, not through speculation, but through exclusion. None of the psychological models evaluated up to that point adequately explained the origin of the information. For the audience following this analysis, this is the moment when the case gains documentary weight. It is not just about an adolescent with intrusive images. It is about a set of descriptions that, when examined with clinical rigor, present an unusual degree of historical coherence. And it was precisely this set of coincidences that led Kübler-Ross to recommend that the case be studied with the same methodology applied to the accounts investigated by Ian Stevenson. With the new protocol established by Kübler-Ross, the team resumed the interviews focusing on 3 criteria: stability of the accounts, absence of external contamination, and factual coherence. The objective was to determine whether the contents presented by Matthias could be explained by traditional psychological processes. For this, the interviews were repeated on alternate days, always with open questions, without direction, and without offering any type of verbal reinforcement, a method widely used in studies of anomalous memory documented by Ian Stevenson. Right from the first sessions of this new phase, an unusual pattern was observed. Matthias's descriptions did not vary. At intervals of up to 2 weeks, when asked to report again what he saw, he reproduced the content with almost no semantic alteration. This was recorded as a high index of narrative stability, a rare piece of data in imaginative accounts. Instead of expanding, his accounts remained concise and invariable, as if they were ready fragments, not constructed at the moment of speech. During one of the sessions, the patient mentioned that, in the intrusive images, people believed the air was sick. The team, without commenting, registered the term. Later, historians consulted confirmed that the concept of miasma, the idea that diseases were transmitted by corrupted air, was dominant in the 14th century, especially during periods of the plague outbreak. This type of historical correspondence strengthened the need for systematic documentation. Ross instructed the team to test Matthias's suggestibility. At certain moments, the interviewers discreetly introduced false information, such as the supposed presence of doctors with beak masks, figures associated with later centuries. The patient rejected these images, stating that it does not correspond to what appears. This reaction, which might go unnoticed by an untrained observer, was considered important because it indicated an absence of uncritical acceptance of induced content, a characteristic incompatible with guided fantasy or suggestive imagination. The team also investigated possible sources of contamination. Teachers, colleagues, and family members were interviewed. None of them reported the young man's interest in the Middle Ages, and there were no records of films, books, or television programs with compatible content. This survey was essential to rule out simple explanations. Until that moment, no external element justified the precision of the accounts. Another solid point observed by Ross was Matthias's behavior when asked about details not present in his intrusive memories. Instead of filling in gaps, as often happens in cases of confabulation, he simply answered, "That doesn't appear," or "That part is not there." This stance indicated that the contents were limited and stable, and not the product of progressive elaborations. Based on this set of observations, Ross classified this phase as the internal coherence confirmation stage. The case, up to that point, maintained characteristics that, in Stevenson's literature, were considered highly significant. With the internal coherence criteria already established, the team moved on to what Ross called independent historical correlation. This stage consisted of comparing each element reported by Matthias with external documentary records, without informing the patient which parts were being verified. The objective was simple: to identify whether the details spontaneously provided corresponded to practices and scenarios of the 14th century, or if they were vague approximations that could be the result of generalized imagination. One of the first elements analyzed was the recurring description of fabrics or flags placed on the facades of houses. In the sessions, Matthias stated that they served to indicate where there was illness. Without any correction or comment, the team registered the account and later consulted documents from Basel and Alpine regions, which confirmed the use of makeshift signs during plague outbreaks. This data was classified as highly specific, as it was not part of modern popular representations of the period. Another fragment that drew attention was the mention of a kind of improvised lime deposit used for quick burials. The patient described that the white powder was placed on top and that this was done to finish quickly. This element, when confronted with historical records, coincided with emergency techniques used in various medieval cities, especially in the current region of Lombardy. The degree of precision was surprising not because of the drama, non-existent in the account, but because of the exact correspondence with documented practices. The team then applied the neutralization protocol. In this method, the interviewer discreetly changes the order of the questions or modifies keywords to observe whether the patient adapts the content. Matthias did not deviate. When something did not belong to what he described as intrusive images, he simply did not complete it. This constancy without expansion was unusual and reinforced the need to keep the case under special classification. A linguistic analysis was also conducted. The consulted specialist verified that the young man never used modern terms to describe 14th century objects or functions. Instead, he used functional descriptions such as a wooden structure for carrying instead of cart, especially in the early sessions. Something also observed in cases studied by Stevenson, where individuals reported images without precise vocabulary, but with coherent technical description. In this phase, Ross emphasized the importance of recording that Matthias did not demonstrate any enthusiasm or expectation of a supernatural interpretation. He was not looking for explanations. He merely described the intrusive content, the absence of emotional or social motivation to maintain or enrich the narrative further reduced the likelihood of conscious invention. At the end of the third stage, the case presented three characteristics that, according to the team's review, were rare when analyzed together: high temporal stability, unusual historical precision, and absence of identifiable external contamination. For Ross, this justified the continuation of the advanced protocol, initially reserved for comparative memory studies. With the accumulation of consistent data, Kübler-Ross recommended that the team execute a more in-depth stage, the potential location analysis. This phase did not seek to confirm a specific geographical origin of the images, but to verify whether the spatial organization described by the patient corresponded to any real medieval urban pattern. The team gathered preserved urban plans of Zurich, Lucerne, Milan, Bologna, Strasbourg, and Passau, comparing them with the descriptions that repeatedly emerged in the sessions. Matthias mentioned very narrow streets, stone buildings positioned with little lateral distance, and areas that seemed closed off with boards during periods of illness. The team noted that these elements, when combined, did not fit the typical urban layout of most 14th century Germanic cities, but appeared more frequently on maps of Lombard regions and Italian Switzerland. This was not enough for specific conclusions, but reinforced the pattern already observed. The patient's accounts did not align with the cultural environment in which he lived, decreasing the chance of imagination based on local references. During this phase, the emotional patterns associated with the descriptions were also analyzed. The team assessed whether there were signs of transferred trauma, psychosomatic anxiety, or symbolic reconstruction mechanisms, possibilities considered before entertaining any non-conventional model. However, the records showed that Matthias reported the images neutrally, without intense emotional charge, and with little variation in intonation. This behavior did not correspond to traditional traumatic memories, which normally arise accompanied by specific physical or emotional reactions. Ross also recommended sequential memory tests. In these, the patient was asked to report the order of the elements whenever possible. Instead of creating logical connections, Matthias maintained the images as independent blocks without narratively stitching them together. This format, fragmented yet stable, appeared frequently in cases of anomalous memories analyzed by Stevenson, where individuals did not create complete stories but only described fragments of experience. In parallel, the team continued evaluating possible alternative causes. Basic medical exams were performed to rule out neurological dysfunctions known to generate intrusive images. Nothing was detected. The psychopathology simulation scale was also applied, with a negative result for attempts at exaggeration or deliberate invention. At the end of this stage, the team reviewed all the collected data. Most of the information provided by Matthias fit into verifiable and historically compatible categories, without apparent sources of contemporary acquisition. There were no indications of psychosis, structural dissociative disorder, confabulation, or external suggestion. And the absence of spontaneous variations in the content further strengthened the degree of internal consistency of the case. Kübler-Ross, in her supervision report, highlighted that the study should be maintained not as an isolated phenomenon, but as part of a larger set of cases that challenge the interpretive boundaries of traditional psychology. Just as she insisted in her clinical approach, Ross noted that science should not assume hasty conclusions, only rigorously record what cannot yet be explained. The final stage of the study focused on drafting the conclusive report, following the pattern Kübler-Ross used when participating in rare clinical analyses. Objective description, absence of unverifiable interpretations, and transparent organization of the data. The team gathered all the material collected during the months of monitoring: interview transcripts, historical analyses, external opinions, clinical exams, and narrative consistency tables. One of the aspects that most caught attention in the final review was the extremely low index of historical inconsistencies. The information offered by Matthias, when segmented into independent narrative units, showed a pattern that, according to the team, did not correspond to typical imaginative accounts. Instead, they presented a technical coherence that approximated what Ian Stevenson classified as spontaneous memories of high precision. Ross made a point of recording this parallel, not as a conclusion, but as a methodological reference. The team also evaluated the functional impact of the intrusive images on the patient's life. Despite the unusual nature of the content, Matthias maintained stable school performance, adequate family relationships, and showed no signs of cognitive or emotional impairment. The phenomenon occurred in isolation, without expanding into delusions, mystical associations, or identity reorganization, factors that would have suggested defined pathologies. In clinical terms, the condition remained classified as intrusive memory of unidentified origin. In the report, Ross emphasized the importance of differentiating the absence of explanation from any attempt at rushed interpretation. According to her clinical stance throughout her career, she reinforced that the team's task is not to conclude beyond the available data, but to rigorously document what does not fit into the current models. This position directly echoed the spirit of Stevenson's work, who between 1960 and 1995 had structured one of the world's largest archives of anomalous memories without resorting to non-scientific explanations. Throughout the analysis, some questions remained unanswered. Why did an adolescent with no contact with advanced historical materials describe specific 14th century sanitary practices? How was it possible that he rejected false information introduced by the team so consistently? And why did the accounts maintain such high stability over time without the alterations typical of narrative construction? None of these questions received a conclusive explanation. And it was precisely this absence that made Matthias's report a relevant document within the institution's clinical archive. The case was catalogued as anomalous memory of high consistency, a category reserved for extremely rare episodes that challenge traditional psychological explanations, but also do not demand speculative interpretations. With the conclusion of Kübler-Ross's supervision, the case remained available to researchers interested in the interface between memory, history, and unclassified phenomena. The complete documentation includes integral transcriptions of the sessions, comparative analyses with medieval records, and multidisciplinary opinions, an archive built precisely to allow future investigations to perhaps find an explanatory model that does not yet exist. Thus, Matthias Kruger's case remained one of the most singular records at the Munich University Clinic in the 1990s. A study that did not seek extraordinary conclusions, but which found, at the limits of rigorous investigation, a phenomenon still not understood by traditional psychology.